In March 1897, when workers began excavating behind a remote farmhouse in Crawford County, Arkansas, they unearthed 7 sets of human remains buried in shallow graves. The county coroner's initial report suggested natural deaths over many years. But when investigators cross-referenced property records with marriage certificates, they discovered all 7 men had been married to the same woman, and every one of them had disappeared within months of their wedding. Before we dive into the story, if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history and the disturbing truths that lie buried in our past, then this channel is your gateway to understanding how such horrors could unfold in plain sight. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these chilling investigations. I want to know who's here with us. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now let's continue with the story. The morning of March 14th, 1897, broke cold and gray over Crawford County, Arkansas. Samuel Hendricks and his construction crew arrived at the Garrett property just after dawn, their wagon loaded with timber and tools for a barn expansion that widow Sarah Garrett had commissioned the previous month. The work seemed straightforward enough: extend the existing structure by 20 feet to accommodate additional livestock. What they discovered 3 feet beneath the Arkansas soil would transform a routine construction project into the most disturbing criminal investigation in the state's history. Hendricks himself drove the first shovel into the earth behind the weathered barn. The blade struck something solid after only a few inches of progress. Assuming he had hit rock, common enough in this part of Arkansas, he adjusted his angle and tried again. This time, the resistance felt different. He called over his foreman, Patrick Dunn, who knelt beside the shallow excavation and began carefully brushing away loose soil with his hands. What emerged was unmistakably human. A skeletal hand, partially preserved by the clay-rich Arkansas earth, reached upward as if grasping for help that had never arrived. Dunn lurched backward, crossing himself. Within minutes, the entire crew had gathered around the discovery, their voices rising in shocked speculation. Someone needed to fetch the sheriff immediately. By noon, Sheriff Thomas Wickham stood surveying a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. His deputies had carefully expanded the excavation site, revealing not one burial, but 7 distinct graves, all positioned in an eerily methodical row behind the barn. Each site contained a complete human skeleton, buried without coffins or ceremony, simply wrapped in deteriorating canvas and placed directly into the earth. The positioning suggested deliberate concealment rather than proper Christian burial. Whoever had interred these bodies had intended for them to remain hidden forever. The Garrett farmhouse sat approximately 50 yards from the burial site, a sagging 2-story structure that had seen better days. Smoke rose from its chimney, indicating the family was home. Sarah Garrett and her 3 adult sons had occupied this property for nearly 20 years, living in relative isolation from their nearest neighbors. The family kept to themselves, attending church irregularly and conducting their business in Van Buren only when absolutely necessary. Now their home sat at the center of what appeared to be a mass grave. Sheriff Wickham approached the farmhouse with 2 deputies flanking him, their hands resting cautiously on their sidearms. Something profoundly wrong had occurred on this property, and the residents would need to provide answers. Sarah Garrett met Sheriff Wickham at her door with remarkable composure for a woman whose property had just become a crime scene. She was 53 years old that March, her face weathered by decades of Arkansas sun, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. When Wickham informed her of the discovery, she showed no visible reaction beyond a slight tightening around her mouth. Her 3 sons, Benjamin, Lucas, and Daniel, stood behind her in the shadowed doorway, silent and watchful. The interrogation began that same afternoon in the sheriff's office. Sarah claimed ignorance of any burials on her property. The land had been in her family since 1878, she explained, and perhaps previous owners had used it as a cemetery. Her story seemed plausible enough until Deputy Marshal Edwin Crawford arrived from Fort Smith with documents that would unravel everything. Crawford had spent the afternoon at the Crawford County Courthouse, systematically pulling marriage records. What he discovered sent ice through Wickham's veins. Between 1878 and 1896, Sarah Garrett had married 7 different men. The first was Joseph Brennan, a widower from Missouri who had purchased the property with Sarah in 1878. According to the marriage certificate, he was 47 years old, a former Union soldier seeking to establish a farm in Arkansas. The marriage took place on June 3, 1878. By April of 1879, Joseph Brennan had vanished from all public records. No death certificate existed. No property transfer had been filed. Yet Sarah Garrett remained on the deed, now listed as sole owner. The county assessor's records showed she had paid the property taxes alone that year. The second marriage occurred in October 1879 to Henry Voss, a German immigrant bachelor who had been working as a farmhand in neighboring Franklin County. The marriage license listed him as 39 years old, unmarried, in good health. He disappeared from documentation by summer of 1880. Marriage 3, Thomas Fairchild, a widower from Tennessee, wed Sarah in March 1881. Gone by December of that same year. Marriage 4, Robert Sinclair, a Kentucky bachelor seeking Arkansas farmland, married Sarah in April 1882. Last documented presence, October 1882. Marriage. 5, William Bradford, another widower, this one from Mississippi, exchanged vows with Sarah in February 1885. The county land office recorded him selling his Mississippi property and transferring the funds to Sarah's bank account in Van Buren. He ceased to exist in any official capacity by September 1885. Marriage 6, Charles Whitaker, a bachelor from Indiana, married Sarah in May 1887. The Van Buren General Store ledger showed him making purchases through August of that year. Then, nothing. Marriage 7, George Pruitt, a widower from Virginia, became Sarah's husband in March 1896. His name appeared in no records after November of that same year. 7 marriages, 7 disappearances, and now 7 bodies buried behind Sarah Garrett's barn. Deputy Crawford laid out an additional discovery that made the pattern even more damning. Census records from 1880 and 1890 both listed Sarah's household composition. Each census showed her 3 sons present, along with a husband whose name matched her current spouse at the time of enumeration. But comparing the 1880 census to the 1890 census revealed different husbands, with no explanation for the change. The census takers had simply recorded what Sarah told them, never questioning why Mr. Garrett's first name kept changing. More disturbing still was the property record trail. Each husband had brought assets into the marriage, either cash savings or property that was quickly sold. Bank records from the Van Buren First National Bank showed deposits made by or on behalf of Joseph Brennan, Henry Voss, Thomas Fairchild, and the others. These funds had built the Garrett farm, purchased livestock, and sustained the family through nearly 20 years. Every husband contributed financially, then vanished. Neighbors interviewed over the following days confirmed the pattern from their own observations. Mrs. Abernathy, whose farm lay 3 miles east, recalled meeting 4 different Mr. Garretts over the years at church functions. Each time, Sarah introduced a new husband, explaining that the previous one had moved on or gone west. The explanation seemed odd, Mrs. Abernathy admitted, but in rural Arkansas, where people came and went seeking opportunity, such stories weren't entirely uncommon. Besides, the Garrett sons had reputations for violent tempers. Nobody wanted trouble with that family. Sheriff Wickham stared at the documents spread across his desk. 7 marriages, 7 disappearances, 7 graves. The mathematics of murder had never been so brutally clear. Sheriff Wickham decided to separate the 3 Garrett sons for questioning. Benjamin, the eldest at 28, sat across from him in the interrogation room with his arms crossed, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. Lucas, 25, occupied a cell down the hall with Deputy Crawford. Daniel, the youngest at 23, waited in a separate holding area with Marshal Edwin Crawford's assistant. Benjamin's story came out smooth and practiced. Each stepfather, he insisted, had simply decided farm life wasn't for them. Joseph Brennan grew restless after 8 months and announced one morning he was heading to California. Henry Voss received a letter from relatives in Germany and departed without warning. Thomas Fairchild got into an argument with Mother about money and stormed off in a rage. The pattern continued through all 7 names. According to Benjamin, these men were drifters, weak-willed individuals who couldn't handle the demands of Arkansas farm life. Good riddance to them all. Lucas told an identical story when Deputy Crawford questioned him. The same explanations, nearly the same phrasing. Even the timeline matched Benjamin's account with suspicious precision. Crawford noted this in his report. The brothers had clearly rehearsed these lies for years, probably at their mother's instruction. But identical stories often crumbled under persistent examination, and Crawford was nothing if not persistent. Daniel proved different. The youngest son fidgeted constantly, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating escape routes. When Marshal Crawford's assistant, a patient man named Albert Moss, asked him about the stepfathers, Daniel's voice wavered. He started with the same rehearsed explanation about men leaving of their own accord. But halfway through describing George Pruitt's supposed departure, he faltered. He didn't really want to leave, Daniel said quietly, then immediately tried to correct himself. I mean, he said he wanted to leave, but Mother convinced him it was best. Moss leaned forward. Convinced him how? Daniel's face went pale. With words. Just talking. That's all. But the crack had appeared. Moss pressed gently, asking about daily life on the farm, about meals, about how the family survived during hard times. Daniel relaxed slightly when the question seemed less threatening. He mentioned how Mother always cooked for the family, how she took great pride in her stews, and how well she could stretch provisions during lean periods. We ate better than most folks around here, Daniel said, a strange note of pride entering his voice. Even during the drought years, when other families were starving, we never went hungry. Mother always managed to keep the larder full. How did she manage that? Moss asked casually. Daniel started to answer, then stopped. His eyes widened, as if realizing he'd wandered into dangerous territory. She was just good at managing, careful with resources. Moss shifted topics to the specific drought years, 1881, 1886, 1893. Each time, Daniel confirmed the family had eaten well, despite crop failures and dying livestock. When asked what they ate during those periods, Daniel mentioned Mother's special stews that only the family consumed. The stepfathers ate differently during their brief tenures, Daniel explained. because Mother said they had particular tastes that needed accommodating. But after they left, Daniel continued, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, Mother would make these rich stews that lasted for weeks. She said it was sinful to waste anything, that God provided, and we had to be grateful for every bit of sustenance He sent our way. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Moss felt his stomach turn, but maintained his calm exterior. These stews after the stepfathers left, they were particularly good? Daniel nodded, then seemed to realize what he was confirming. I mean, they were just regular stews. Nothing special. Just what, Daniel? Just meat and vegetables, that's all. Just normal food. Benjamin's voice suddenly rang out from somewhere down the hall, shouting for his brother to shut his mouth. Daniel jumped as if struck, his face contorting with fear. Lucas joined the shouting from his cell, both older brothers screaming threats and warnings. The carefully maintained facade had shattered. Daniel began to weep, his hands shaking violently. I didn't know at first, he whispered, the words barely audible over his brother's continued shouting. I swear I didn't understand what she was doing, not until I was older. By then, what could I do? She's our mother. She said it was survival. She said God would forgive us because we had no choice. Albert Moss sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. The implications of Daniel's confession stretched far beyond simple murder. Something far more horrific had occurred in the Garrett household, something that violated every law of God and man. He needed Sheriff Wickham immediately. Dr. James Holloway arrived at the Crawford County morgue on March 17th with his medical instruments and a growing sense of dread. Sheriff Wickham had summoned him urgently after Daniel Garrett's disturbing testimony, requesting a thorough examination of all 7 sets of remains. Holloway was the county's most experienced medical examiner, having served in that capacity for 12 years. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what he would document over the following 3 days. The remains lay arranged on 7 separate tables in the morgue's examination room. Time and Arkansas soil had reduced each body to skeletal form, though fragments of canvas wrapping still clung to some bones. Holloway began with the first victim, carefully cataloging every detail in his examination notes. The skeleton belonged to a male approximately 40 to 50 years old at time of death, consistent with Joseph Brennan's documented age. Cause of death was not immediately apparent from skeletal evidence alone. But as Holloway examined the bones more closely, he noticed discoloration on several fragments. Drawing samples from the femur and ribs, he conducted chemical tests using methods pioneered by toxicologists in recent years. The results showed unmistakable traces of arsenic, a poison that could be detected in bone tissue even years after death. He found similar evidence in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 7th skeletons. 5 of the 7 victims had been systematically poisoned. The 6th skeleton puzzled him initially. The skull showed evidence of massive trauma, a crushing blow to the back of the head that would have caused instant death. No arsenic traces appeared in this victim's bones. Perhaps Charles Whitaker had grown suspicious, and Sarah had been forced to use more direct methods. The 5th victim, William Bradford, also showed no arsenic, but displayed a fractured hyoid bone in the neck, suggesting strangulation. Yet these findings, horrific as they were, paled beside what Holloway discovered next. As he examined the long bones of each skeleton, he found patterns that made his hands tremble. Multiple bones showed deliberate cut marks, inconsistent with burial preparation or autopsy. These were butchering marks, the kind a skilled hunter might make when processing a deer carcass. The cuts appeared on femurs, ribs, and humeral bones, always in locations that would allow for maximum meat removal. Holloway had seen similar markings only once before, in medical school, when studying remains recovered from the Donner Party expedition. His professor had explained how desperate starvation could drive human beings to unspeakable acts. But the Donner Party had been trapped in mountain snow, facing certain death without intervention. The Garrett family had lived on a functioning farm, with access to towns and supplies. He examined the pelvis and vertebrae of each victim, noting additional evidence of systematic dismemberment. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with experience in animal processing, someone who understood anatomy well enough to separate muscle from bone efficiently. Several ribs showed scoring marks where a blade had scraped against the surface, exactly as one would see when removing meat for cooking or preservation. His most disturbing discovery came when analyzing the smaller bones. Several phalanges, the bones of fingers and toes, were missing from multiple skeletons. These small bones were often lost during burial, but their absence across all 7 bodies followed a pattern. In traditional butchering, extremities were typically discarded or used for stock. The methodical nature of these missing pieces suggested intentional processing rather than natural decomposition. Holloway spent his final day writing a detailed report for Sheriff Wickham. The document represents what researchers consider one of the earliest forensic analyses of serial murder in American criminal history. In his conclusion, Holloway stated plainly what the evidence demanded. The evidence suggests these victims were not merely murdered. They appear to have been systematically poisoned or killed, then subjected to post-mortem butchering, consistent with food preparation. Given the timeline of deaths coinciding with known periods of economic hardship, and considering the youngest son's testimony regarding the family's unusual prosperity during famine years, I must conclude that these remains show evidence of anthropophagy, commonly known as cannibalism. He signed the report with a shaking hand, then sealed it in an envelope marked confidential. Some truths were too terrible to speak aloud, without absolute certainty, and Holloway had found that certainty carved into human bone. When Sheriff Wickham read the report later that evening, he sat in silence for nearly an hour before finally speaking. "God help us all," he whispered. "What kind of monster raises her own sons to do this?" Deputy Marshal Edwin Crawford took the morning train to Van Buren with Dr. Holloway's report burning in his coat pocket. If 5 victims had been poisoned with arsenic, someone had supplied that poison. In rural Arkansas during the late 19th century, arsenic came from one primary source: rat poison sold at general stores. Crawford knew exactly where to begin his search. Mortimer's General Store stood on Van Buren's main street, a weathered building that had served the community since 1869. The proprietor, Harold Mortimer, was a meticulous record keeper who maintained purchase ledgers dating back to the store's opening. When Crawford explained his purpose, Mortimer's face went ashen. He disappeared into his back office and returned carrying a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed with age. Crawford settled at a table in the store's back room and began his examination. Arkansas law required merchants to record purchases of rat poison containing arsenic compounds, though enforcement was lax in rural areas. Mortimer had followed the regulation faithfully, noting each sale with the buyer's name, date, and quantity purchased. Crawford started with the ledger from 1878. The first entry appeared on July 20th, 1878, barely 6 weeks after Sarah Garrett's marriage to Joseph Brennan. She had purchased 2 pounds of arsenic-based rat poison, an unusually large quantity for a single farm. Mortimer's notation indicated she paid cash and signed her name clearly in the ledger. Crawford felt his pulse quicken as he turned pages forward, searching for the next purchase. September 15th, 1878. Another 2 pounds. December 3rd, 1878. 3 pounds this time. Then nothing until March 18th, 1879. Just before Joseph Brennan disappeared from all records, 4 pounds purchased that spring day. Crawford pulled out Dr. Holloway's estimated dates of death and began cross-referencing them with the poison purchases. The correlation was undeniable. Every victim's approximate time of death fell within weeks of Sarah Garrett buying substantial quantities of arsenic. She had purchased the poison like clockwork throughout her marriage to each husband, then ceased buying it after their disappearance, only to resume when a new husband arrived. The pattern held across nearly 20 years. During her marriage to Henry Voss in 1879 and 1880, she bought rat poison every 2 to 3 months. After his death, purchases stopped entirely until Thomas Fairchild entered her life in 1881. The cycle repeated with mechanical precision through all 7 marriages. But Crawford noticed something else in the ledgers that made his blood run cold. Between marriages, Sarah Garrett made almost no purchases of food staples. During the periods when she was supposedly a widow, living alone with her sons, the ledger showed minimal buying activity. Yet during each marriage, she purchased flour, sugar, salt, and other provisions regularly, as one would expect from a household feeding multiple adults. After each husband vanished, her grocery purchases dropped to nearly nothing for months at a time. How had the family eaten during those gaps? They owned livestock according to tax records, but not enough to sustain 4 adults for extended periods. The garden plots on their property could supplement a diet, but wouldn't provide complete nutrition, especially during Arkansas winters. Yet neighbors had consistently reported seeing the Garrett family looking healthy and well-fed, even prosperous. Crawford found his answer in a notation from April 1881, during the severe drought that had devastated Crawford County farms. Most families were purchasing increased amounts of provisions to supplement failing crops. Sarah Garrett bought nothing. The ledger showed no food purchases between February and July of that year, a 5-month gap during which Thomas Fairchild had disappeared. She bought arsenic in March, then nothing else until August, when she began courting Robert Sinclair. The same pattern appeared during the 1886 drought, and again in 1893. Economic records from those years documented widespread hunger throughout rural Arkansas, with county relief efforts distributing emergency provisions. The Garrett family never applied for assistance. They simply bought arsenic, then vanished from the commercial record while their husbands vanished from life itself. Mortimer watched Crawford work in silence, his face growing increasingly disturbed as the deputy made notes and calculations. Finally, he spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I sold her that poison for nearly 20 years, he said. She always claimed rats were terrible in the barn, that they got into everything. I never questioned it. God forgive me, I never asked why she needed so much." Crawford closed the final ledger and gathered his documentation. He now possessed irrefutable evidence of premeditation, spanning 2 decades. Sarah Garrett hadn't simply murdered her husbands in moments of rage or desperation. She had planned each death methodically, purchasing the means of execution months in advance, timing the poisonings with calculated precision. And the financial records suggested something even worse. She had turned murder into a system of survival, trading human life for sustenance during the hardest years. Sheriff Wickham spread 3 sets of documents across his desk: Dr. Holloway's autopsy findings, Deputy Crawford's poison purchase records, and a new report from the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Office detailing crop failures and drought conditions between 1878 and 1897. What emerged was a timeline of horror that made simple murder seem merciful by comparison. The drought of 1881 had been catastrophic for Crawford County. Spring rains never came, and by June, crops withered in fields across the region. Corn stalks turned brown and brittle. Wheat harvests failed entirely. Livestock died from lack of forage, their carcasses littering pastures. County relief records, preserved in the courthouse archives, documented the suffering in stark bureaucratic language. Over 200 families applied for emergency food assistance that year. Children went to bed hungry. Several elderly residents died from malnutrition-related illnesses. The Garrett family applied for no assistance. According to tax records, they owned only 3 pigs and a handful of chickens that year, insufficient to feed 4 adults through a full season, let alone survive a prolonged drought. Their garden plot, measured by the county assessor at roughly 1/8 of an acre, couldn't possibly have sustained them. Yet when Reverend Paul Hutchins from the Van Buren Methodist Church visited isolated families that autumn to distribute relief supplies, he noted in his parish journal that the Garretts declined his offer. Sarah told him they were managing fine, that God had provided for their needs. Thomas Fairchild had vanished in December of that year, roughly 9 months after marrying Sarah. Dr. Holloway's analysis estimated his death occurred in late November or early December, based on decomposition patterns and burial depth. The timing aligned perfectly with the worst period of the drought, when most families were consuming their final stored provisions and facing a bleak winter. The second major drought struck in 1886, this time lasting from April through October. Wickham found a newspaper article from the Van Buren Press, dated September 12, 1886, describing the crisis. "Our county faces its gravest challenge in memory," the editor wrote. "Fields lie barren, wells run dry, and the specter of starvation haunts many homesteads. We call upon all citizens of means to contribute what they can to the relief fund, that none may perish in this time of tribulation." William Bradford disappeared in September 1886. The poison purchase ledger showed Sarah buying 4 pounds of arsenic in July of that year. Bradford's skeleton showed no arsenic traces, only evidence of strangulation, suggesting perhaps the poison hadn't worked quickly enough, and she had resorted to more direct methods. Either way, the family gained another source of sustenance precisely when they needed it most. The third drought, beginning in spring of 1893, brought conditions even worse than its predecessors. State agricultural reports documented complete crop failure across western Arkansas. The governor authorized emergency grain shipments from eastern counties. Churches organized relief committees. Families abandoned farms entirely, loading possessions onto wagons and heading toward cities where work and food might be found. George Pruitt married Sarah Garrett in March 1896, as the region was still recovering from the 1893 drought's economic devastation. He lasted until November, dying during the autumn, when food stores typically ran lowest before winter provisions could be secured. His skeleton showed heavy arsenic contamination. Wickham interviewed elderly residents who remembered all 3 drought periods. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, age 74 in 1897, lived 2 miles from the Garrett property. She recalled seeing the Garrett sons during the 1893 drought, healthy and robust, while her own grandchildren grew thin and weak from insufficient food. "I remember thinking it was peculiar," she told Wickham. "My husband worked hard, we had good land, but that year nearly broke us. Lost 2 milk cows and most of our chickens, yet those Garrett boys looked fed and strong as oxen. Sarah must have been a miracle worker in the kitchen, I thought. God help me, I actually envied her skills. Another neighbor, Thomas Rutledge, mentioned seeing smoke from the garret chimney during odd hours. Middle of summer nights during the '86 drought, he recalled. Thought it strange they'd be cooking when the heat was already unbearable. But I minded my business. Those sons had mean temperaments, especially the older two. Wasn't worth asking questions. The pattern became inescapable. Sarah Garrett had turned her husbands into provisions, timing their deaths to coincide with periods of greatest need. She had built a system of survival that treated human beings as livestock, harvesting them when circumstances demanded. Her sons had been raised in this nightmare, taught from youth that their mother's horrific calculations were simply practical necessities. The famine years hadn't created monsters. They had simply revealed the depths of monstrosity that already existed. As word of the Garrett case spread through Crawford County during late March 1897, Sheriff Wickham found himself confronting a question more disturbing than the murders themselves. How had an entire community failed to notice, or worse, chosen to ignore 2 decades of obvious warning signs? The answer forced residents to examine their own complicity in enabling unspeakable horror. Martha Caldwell had lived a half-mile from the Garrett property since 1879. When Wickham interviewed her on March 23rd, she sat in her parlor, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. Yes, she admitted. She had noticed the peculiar pattern of disappearing husbands. She remembered meeting Joseph Brennan at a church social, then months later seeing Sarah with a different man she introduced as her new husband, Henry Voss. I asked her what happened to Joseph, Martha recalled. She said he'd gone to California seeking gold, that farm life didn't suit him. It seemed odd, him leaving so sudden without saying goodbye to anyone. But people did move on frequently back then, chasing opportunities west. When the third husband vanished and a fourth appeared, Martha grew suspicious enough to mention it to her husband, Gerald. He told her to mind her own business. The Garrett sons had reputations throughout the county for violence, particularly Benjamin and Lucas. They had beaten a merchant in Van Buren badly enough to require medical attention after an argument over prices. They intimidated neighbors whose livestock wandered onto Garrett land. Most people gave the family a wide berth. We were afraid, Martha said simply. Gerald said if I went asking questions about their business, those boys might come calling on us some night. We had children to think about. So I stayed quiet. Reverend Hutchins provided similar testimony. He had served the Van Buren Methodist Church since 1876 and knew the Garrett family's history intimately. In his private study, he showed Wickham his parish records documenting Sarah's multiple marriages. Each wedding had been performed at the church, with Hutchins officiating. He had married Sarah to Joseph, then to Henry, then to Thomas. After the third wedding, I took Sarah aside and asked about her previous husbands, Hutchins said, his voice heavy with guilt. She told me they were weak men who couldn't handle hardship, that God had seen fit to remove them from her life so she could find stronger partners. I accepted her explanation because questioning further seemed uncharitable. The Lord calls us to think well of our neighbors, not to suspect them of wickedness. But Hutchins admitted he had felt growing unease with each subsequent marriage. After performing the ceremony for Sarah and William Bradford, he noted in his journal, I pray this union proves more enduring than Widow Garrett's previous marriages. There is something in her manner that troubles my spirit, though I cannot name what. He never acted on that troubled spirit. The Van Buren constable's records revealed that 2 separate individuals had filed informal complaints about the Garrett family over the years. In 1883, a traveling peddler reported to authorities that he had stopped at the Garrett farm seeking to sell wares, and noticed what appeared to be fresh graves behind the barn. The constable noted the complaint, but took no action, writing in his log that many rural families maintain private burial plots for livestock or family members. Again, in 1890, a neighboring farmer named Douglas Fletcher reported seeing the Garrett sons dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas from their barn to the field behind it late one evening. Fletcher thought it suspicious enough to mention to local law enforcement. The constable interviewed Benjamin Garrett, who explained they were disposing of a dead horse. No further investigation occurred. "We failed those men," Fletcher told Wickham bitterly. "I saw something wrong and convinced myself it was probably innocent. Easier than making enemies of dangerous people. Every person who stayed silent has blood on their hands." The Van Buren schoolteacher, Miss Caroline Hughes, remembered the Garrett sons as pupils in the 1870s and early 80s. Daniel, the youngest, had shown signs of distress even as a child. He once told her his mother made him help with butchering, but wouldn't elaborate. She assumed he meant farm animals and didn't pursue the subject. Looking back, she wondered if a frightened child had been trying to reveal the truth, and she had simply failed to understand. The community's silence had been built on fear, social conventions, and the human tendency to accept convenient explanations rather than confront disturbing possibilities. Rural Arkansas in the late 19th century operated on principles of self-reliance and non-interference. What happened on a family's property was their business. Asking too many questions violated unspoken social codes. The Garrett sons' violent reputations reinforced those barriers with threats of physical retribution. Now, Crawford County faced the consequences of 2 decades of willful blindness, and the weight of 7 dead men demanded answers that no one could provide. Lucas Garrett broke first. 3 weeks into confinement, isolated from his mother and brothers, the middle son requested to speak with Deputy Crawford on April 8, 1897. What emerged over the following 3 days of testimony was recorded in 78 pages of handwritten notes, described by historians as among the most disturbing confession records in American criminal history. Crawford brought a court stenographer to document every word. Lucas sat hunched in his cell, his hands clasped between his knees, speaking in a monotone voice, as if reciting facts divorced from their moral weight. He began with his earliest memory, being 4 years old and watching his mother prepare supper while Joseph Brennan lay sick in the bedroom upstairs. "She told us he had influenza," Lucas said. "But I remember her adding powder to his soup from a small tin she kept hidden in the pantry. She made me take it up to him. He died 2 days later." After Brennan's death, Sarah directed her sons, then aged 4, 7, and 10, to help their older brother Benjamin drag the body to the barn. She told them their stepfather needed to be buried quickly because of disease, that they couldn't afford a proper funeral, that this was God's will and they must never speak of it. Benjamin, the eldest, understood what was happening. Lucas and Daniel were too young to fully comprehend. "Benjamin did most of the work," Lucas continued, his voice flat. "Mother showed him how to use the knives, where to cut. She said we couldn't waste anything, that God would punish wastefulness. I was 7 years old before I understood what meat I was eating." The pattern established itself over years. Sarah would court lonely men seeking farm opportunities or companionship. She selected carefully, targeting those with savings or property, but few family connections, men whose disappearance might go unquestioned. She married them, consolidated their assets, then began the slow poisoning. The arsenic she mixed into their food caused gradual illness that mimicked natural disease. Most victims lingered for weeks, growing increasingly debilitated before death finally came. She always made it look like sickness, Lucas explained. Consumption, influenza, stomach ailments. Nobody questioned it back then. People died from illness all the time in rural areas. After each death, the brothers helped dispose of the bodies in the barn. Sarah supervised the process with clinical detachment, instructing her sons in butchering techniques she claimed to have learned from her own father, a hunter and trapper. She wrapped certain portions in canvas and stored them in the root cellar, explaining this was how families survived hard times, that their stepfathers were providing for them, even in death. She made it seem holy somehow, Lucas said, his voice cracking for the first time. Like we were following some higher law that regular people didn't understand. She quoted scripture about not wasting God's gifts, about Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac. She twisted everything into justification. The drought years had been particularly terrible. During 1881, when Thomas Fairchild died, the family subsisted almost entirely on what Sarah called provisions for 3 months. Lucas was 12 years old enough to fully understand, but young enough to believe his mother's religious rationalization. She told them repeatedly that God had sent these men to sustain the family, that refusing this sustenance would be rejecting divine providence. We were hungry, Lucas whispered. Hungrier than you can imagine. When you're that hungry, your mind stops working right. You convince yourself of anything. Crawford asked about specific victims. Lucas provided methodical details about each murder. Henry Voss had grown suspicious and confronted Sarah about irregularities in their finances. She increased his arsenic dosage dramatically, and he died within days. Robert Sinclair tried to leave after discovering the poison tin in the pantry. Benjamin and Lucas, then teenagers, physically prevented his departure on their mother's orders. Sarah strangled him that night while he slept. William Bradford fought back when the poison took effect, and he realized what was happening. The struggle left him with a broken hyoid bone before he finally died. Charles Whitaker actually made it off the property, but collapsed a mile down the road. The sons retrieved his body under cover of darkness and brought him back to the barn. George Pruitt was the worst, Lucas said, tears finally streaming down his face. He was kind to us. He didn't deserve what happened. But Mother said we needed provisions for winter, and I helped anyway. God forgive me, I helped with all of them. Crawford asked the question that had haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Why hadn't the sons stopped their mother or reported her crimes? Lucas looked up with hollow eyes. She's our mother, he said simply. She raised us to believe this was survival. By the time we understood it was wrong, we were already accomplices. Where could we go? What could we say? We were trapped in it from childhood, and every year made escape more impossible. The confession implicated all 3 brothers in varying degrees, but Lucas made clear that Sarah had orchestrated everything. She was the architect of this sustained horror, and her sons were both victims and perpetrators of her monstrous system. The trial began on September 15, 1897, in the federal courthouse at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Judge Isaac Parker, known throughout the territory as the hanging judge, presided over proceedings that would captivate newspaper readers across America. The courtroom overflowed with spectators who had traveled from neighboring states to witness what journalists were calling the most depraved case in American judicial history. Prosecutor William Hayes built his case with methodical precision over 8 days of testimony. He presented the marriage records, the poison purchase ledgers, Dr. Holloway's autopsy findings, and the financial documentation showing how each husband's assets had enriched the Garrett family. Deputy Crawford testified about the burial site discovery. Harold Mortimer from the general store identified Sarah's signature in the arsenic purchase records. Neighbors described the pattern of disappearing husbands spanning nearly 20 years. Then came Lucas Garrett's confession, read aloud by the court clerk. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the 78 pages detailed each murder and its aftermath. Several spectators fled the room when the clerk reached the sections describing what had been done to the victim's remains. One woman fainted and required medical attention. Even Judge Parker, who had sentenced dozens of men to hang during his career, visibly paled. Benjamin and Daniel attempted to recant their earlier statements, claiming they had been coerced and that Lucas was lying to save himself. Their attorney, a Fort Smith lawyer named Edmund Pierce, argued that the sons were victims of their mother's influence, raised from childhood in an environment of abuse and manipulation that had warped their moral understanding. He pleaded for mercy based on their circumstances. Sarah Garrett never spoke. Throughout the entire trial, she sat motionless at the defense table, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. Her attorney, appointed by the court after she refused to hire representation, mounted a feeble defense, suggesting the evidence was circumstantial and that the bodies could have belonged to anyone. The jury found this argument laughable, given the documented marriage records and Lucas's detailed confession. Hayes delivered his closing argument on September 23rd, speaking for nearly 2 hours. He described Sarah Garrett as a calculating predator who had turned matrimony into murder and her own sons into accomplices to unspeakable acts. He demanded justice not just for the 7 identified victims, but for the moral order that her crimes had violated. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned verdicts of guilty on all counts for all 4 defendants. Judge Parker scheduled sentencing for the following week, and the entire nation waited to learn what punishment could possibly fit such monstrous crimes. Judge Parker delivered his sentences on October 1st, 1897. Sarah Garrett received death by hanging, making her only the 3rd woman sentenced to execution in Arkansas during the 19th century. Her sons received life imprisonment with hard labor at the Arkansas State Penitentiary. Parker's statement from the bench was brief, but searing. "You have committed acts that defy the boundaries of human depravity," he told Sarah. "You corrupted your own children, murdered 7 men who sought nothing but companionship, and violated laws both divine and mortal. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none to offer." Sarah's execution was scheduled for December 10th. In the weeks leading to that date, numerous clergy members attempted to visit her cell seeking confession or repentance. She refused them all, maintaining the same stony silence she had kept throughout the trial. The warden noted she ate sparingly, slept little, and spent hours staring at the wall without speaking or showing emotion. On the morning of her execution, nearly 2,000 spectators gathered at the Fort Smith gallows. Sarah walked to the platform without assistance, her face still betraying no fear or remorse. When offered a chance for final words, she declined. The hood was placed over her head at 9:37 in the morning. 3 minutes later, Sarah Garrett was dead. That same afternoon, a mob of Crawford County citizens descended on the Garrett farmhouse. They doused the structure in kerosene and set it ablaze, burning it to its foundations. The barn where 7 men had been butchered met the same fate. By nightfall, nothing remained but scorched earth and the memory of horrors committed there. The case forced Arkansas to implement significant legal reforms. The state legislature passed new requirements for marriage record verification and mandated investigation of any spouse's disappearance. County sheriffs received training in recognizing patterns of domestic violence and suspicious deaths. Rural isolation could no longer serve as cover for domestic crimes. The 7 victims, finally identified through marriage records, received proper burial in Van Buren Cemetery on November 3rd. Their shared gravestone bears a simple inscription: Joseph Brennan, Henry Voss, Thomas Fairchild, Robert Sinclair, William Bradford, Charles Whitaker, George Pruitt. Murdered 1878 to 1896. May they rest in the peace they were denied in life. If you found this historical investigation as haunting as we did, help us continue uncovering America's darkest forgotten chapters by clicking that like button and subscribing to the channel. These stories demand to be remembered, and your support ensures these victims are never forgotten. We'll see you in the next investigation, where we'll examine another case that history tried to bury.